Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome you to the second session of the UNESCO Policy Dialogue on Digital Preservation of Documentary Heritage. This policy dialogue is organized by UNESCO Memory of the World Programme through the Preservation Subcommittee and in partnership with the Information for All Working Group on Information Preservation. It is associated with the celebration of the World Day for Audiovisual Heritage. My name is Natasha Milic-Freiling. I'm member of the UNESCO Preservation Subcommittee and will host this session. The UNESCO Policy Dialogue is an important step towards UNESCO's international policy agenda for digital preservation to address challenges that are confronting governments, memory institutions, and the community in preserving digital documentary heritage. UNESCO's objective is to facilitate, support legal frameworks and sustainable and effective approaches to digital preservation. The dialogue is conducted in two sessions. The session one was held this morning, Central European Time. The second session is the one that you are attending right now. The morning session, we had almost 380 attendees and are pleased with the community responses. Those of you who could not join us for the morning session, please visit UNESCO YouTube channel for the recordings. The session one recording includes the welcoming speech by Mr. Singche, Deputy Director General of UNESCO. Mr. Singche voiced UNESCO's concern and commitment to facilitating information dialogue and actions to address the challenges of digital preservation that all the nations face. Session one also includes a keynote presentation by Mr. David Fricker, the Vice Chair of the International Advisory Committee of the Memory of the World Programme. Mr. Fricker highlighted UNESCO's active role in increasing the awareness and mobilizing nations to act on the digital preservation issues. He pointed to a wide range of issues that we are facing and highlighted 4 specific ones that are part of this policy dialogue. They include policy challenges of technologies, sustainability, legal frameworks, and practices, including preserving cultural identities at risk. The morning session covered 2 topics: the cultural identity at risk and sustainability. In this afternoon session, we continue with the policy dialogue on technology and legal frameworks. Each topic includes presentations, dialogue contributors, and questions from the audience. The Zoom session is live streamed to UNESCO YouTube channel. The program is recorded and will be available at any time later. There is a simultaneous translation in French, so you can select the French or English YouTube channel to participate in the dialogue. The Zoom attendees are invited to use Q&A Zoom feature to ask questions or comment. At the end of each topic, the participants will consider questions from the audience. Following the topic discussion this afternoon, we are going to have a special session at the end. It's not a keynote, it's a lock note. For the lock note, we invited representatives from UNESCO and the community, including IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, and ICA, International Council of Archives, to reflect on the points raised in today's discussion. So we will now move to the second section, the topic C, the technology session, that will be dedicated to the issues of policy and challenges facing digital preservation. I'm now pleased to introduce Mr. Kevin Bradley, who will be the moderator of this session. Mr. Bradley is Assistant Director General at the National Archives of Australia. He has served for years at the UNESCO Subcommittee on Technology and is now a member of the Preservation Subcommittee. may I invite Mr. Bradley to introduce the topic and the participants. And I wish to thank him for tuning in at 3 a.m. in the morning, Canberra's time.
Thank you, Natasha. And welcome to the technology session. I will keep my introduction very short so as the time is available for our speakers. We have 2 speakers in this session and 3 dialogue contributors. And the first speaker is Gunter Serenek, Senior Consultant with Serenek Information and Communication Technology for Development. Gunter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And I start now my PowerPoint. Just a second. So I just tested it, but for the moment it doesn't work. Just a second, please. Yes. So this is our presentation on Kadka Grassroot digitization projects. And we could say UNESCO recommendations concerning the preservation of and access to documentary heritage, including in digital form from Paris 2016, is recognizing that over time, considerable parts of documentary heritage have disappeared due to natural or human disasters or are becoming inaccessible through rapid technological change. Supportive regional action plans were elaborated for this recommendation. For example, Abuja Action Plan for Implementation 2018 by the Africa Committee, or the Pacific Member States Action Plan SUBA 2017, Committee Asia Pacific, with specific problems for the small island development states. And here, networking of institutions, as suggested this morning, might be really a solution. But this contribution is about affordable do-it-yourself, but very powerful digitization workstations, not only, but especially appropriate for memory institutions, suitable for work with an utmost big variety of objects. Kadka abbreviation stands for Competence Center Archive Digitization in Karlsruhe, Germany, and is based on expertise in high quality photographic digitization and the knowledge of providing digital education. Firstly, this non-profit project aims to empower memory institutions globally to digitize their templates by themselves to prevent the loss of heritage. The project is establishing a do-it-yourself workshop in which the development and production of workstations for archive digitizations are realized. Second, as part of the second phase of the project, evaluations in interested African memory institutions are planned to prepare 2-week workshops while using the produced workstations in Karlsruhe. In addition, the trainees can visit memory institutions in the region and discuss technical and administrative experiences. After the workshop, support is planned for the construction of the archive digitization workstations for the cooperating archives. Contacts to the African archives will be made through the City of Karlsruhe Cooperation Network and supported by the German UNESCO Commission, the UNESCO programs IFAB and MOV. The workstation is this prototype. You can see the column from aluminium, but the rest more or less is made of wood. You have height, a alterable device for the camera, then the small original holder table, and the height alterable device for this holder. You have then below the Fresnel lens and the light source for through light to have negatives and so on. And on the right side, you see the small parcels. We can pack it in the lighting unit, the column, and the rest. So it's very easy to manufacture, so to do it yourself. 3 grassroots aspects. Except for the sophisticated parts, the cameras, lenses, and computers, all the components of the construction of the workstations are technically simple and can be realized by the users themselves. For example, with the involvement of local craftsmen, carpenter, for example. In the planning of the Kadka, a workshop is foreseen in which seminar participants can realize their own projects according to their needs. Kadka workstations are based on an open modular system, on resource materials that are available in almost all countries, based on robust but lightweighted, quick setup and transport by car. Sustainability aspects. The project fits into Sustainable Development Goal 16, ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms, and in SDG 17, strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. And further, affordable technological solutions have to be developed and disseminated widely. The Kadka Competence Center is planned to help all those who are interested to realize by themselves high-quality digitization workstations, supported by video, text instruction, and face-to-face seminars in Karlsruhe. The local production of the workstation makes local maintenance possible. As the disassembled workstation can be transported in normal passenger cars, it can be used in different locations, shared use. In addition, it is easy to take the camera out of the workstation and use it for other purposes, dual use. The cost of the universal Kadka workstation is much lower in comparison to industrial products. In addition, much more flexible and easier to transport. A pilot project, South Sudan. For South Sudan, independent since 2011, the documentary heritage is part of nation building and co-funded by the government of Norway through UNESCO Juba office. With support of the Secretariat of IFA program in Paris and the UNESCO Juba office, a one-week training workshop was realized in 2019 in Karlsruhe with 2 archivists from the South Sudan National Archive from Juba. A Kadka workstation was financed and is since August 2020 awaiting shipment to Juba, delayed in Corona times. And the Kadka training in Juba is planned for mid-2020, if possible. And here, digitalization contributes to recovery of history. Technological features of the workstation are the digital camera, the camera control application, stitching technique for large formats, and parallel lighting. The quality references, what we have built specific units of the workstation for the University Archive, Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, KIT. There are 3 workstations in place and they are operated by students. You can see here one desk where they work and where they work on the digitization. And on the back, you see the Kadka workstation. Then on the experience is in the County Archive Rastatt. They used in the last 3 years for digitizing 260,000 pages of historical newspapers, these workstations, and the workstations were also used for realizing the exposition at Prince Max Palais, city of Karlsruhe, on history of photography. So here you see one example of this historic photography exposition. Here you see one daguerreotype is taken 1840. Daguerreotype is a unique image on a silver copper plate. For that reason, it's very difficult also to digitize. Nevertheless, with this equipment, it worked, and it was the exposition symbol and blown up to 2.40 meters to 1 meter. And the daguerreotype is only postcard size to imagine, so the quality must be quite good. On the right upper corner, you see also the digitization of a Minox slide from 1960, for example, and below how to digitize books, and further below maps of very high quality. So as policy statements, the Kadka project's digital camera digitizing meets professional standards. Templates as photos, slides, posters, negative on glass and film, books, posters, paintings, documents, manuscripts, objects, templates of any kind, affordable archive digitization, avoiding costly outsourcing solutions, establishing in-house capacities for memory institutions. Responsibility for achieving the qualification must be integrated to a job description, and enabling the building of virtual collections and online catalogs for a broad audience and professional use in education and research. A broader statement is also, I want to add, in-house capacity building in memory institutions for both digitization processes and design of web presence of the digitized collections in cooperation with history departments of related universities will improve accessibility and visibility. For these purposes, an appropriate developed massive open online course could support staff in memory institutions. I would also mention that if you are interested, you can get further information on an expose on this address by Mr. Gross. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gunther. Thank you for that excellent presentation on the affordable technology, but backed up by standards, training and support. We will, of course, talk about it further, but right now I'd like to introduce our second speaker. Our second speaker is Dietrich Schuler from the Preservation Subcommittee of the UNESCO Memory of the World. And he, on World Audiovisual Heritage Day, will be speaking to us about the Magnetic Tape Alert project, safeguarding the documents proper of cultural and linguistic diversity. Dietrich, the floor is yours.
Here I come. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, for this introduction. I'm loading my screen. Yes. Okay. Okay. Can you see my my PowerPoint?
Indeed, we can.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm talking today about the Magnetic Tape Alert Project, and its subtitle is Safeguarding the Documents Proper of Cultural and Linguistic Diversity. So you will notice that although this is in the technology session, it's actually, from content-wise, a topic which would have perfectly suited the cultural identity at risk session this morning. Well, dissimilar to text documents, audio and video recordings are machine-readable documents, and this means that apart from a carrier, from a document in good physical and chemical condition, you have to have a replay equipment, and if the documents are digital, you need the decoding software. Now, for 50 years, magnetic tape has been the predominant recording medium. Magnetic tape recording was actually already developed in the 1930s, but internationally it came up after World War II and was heavily employed for radio, television, and the recording industry. But not only for those great and also wealthy institutions, it was also used immediately for academic and scholarly purposes, which led to the mushrooming of audiovisual collections in academia, universities, and cultural institutions. Now, the typical contents of such recordings were endangered language, folklore, music, dance, ritual, oral history, the First Nations recordings, etc. We have heard about those earlier today. In summary, it is not exaggerated to say that a great part of these magnetic tape recordings are actually the document proper, the originals of our present day knowledge of the linguistic and cultural diversity of humankind. Now, in the 1990s, the technical background shifted and there was a gradual move of audiovisual recording from magnetic tape to IT. This started with audio already around 1990, for video 10 years later, and today it is even employed for film recording and film preservation. Consequently, of course, then the production of equipment and spare parts ceased for magnetic tape recording devices, and even the service faded. Some of you may remember that 2016 Sony has stopped the service for their video tape recorders. Now, today, all magnetic tape formats, audio and video, analog and digital, are dead. Now, how can audiovisual, specifically audio and video recordings be preserved? They can only be preserved by digital content migration to escape the danger of obsolescence of hardware. So that means that the content has to be separated from the original carriers and has to be transferred to digital repositories. And again, this started already in the early or to mid 1990s for audio. For video, it came a bit later, and it's now also practiced for film. YASA standardized this methodology already in 1997, and we have now the 4th edition of a document which is on the screen, which has been released in 2017. Now, the problem we are facing today is that the replay equipment in operable condition is rapidly vanishing, and the regular transfer will be actually an adventure after 2025. So the professional archives, national audiovisual archives, broadcast archives, they have been aware of the threat, and they have planned for the transfer to digital repositories already 20 years ago, have started to do so. Some have already finished, but others are aware that it is a race against the time. However, the small academic collections, which are often lacking funds, expertise, and equipment, they have not yet, or only to a small extent, yet safeguarded their holdings. Some are even not aware of the threat. And in this situation, YASA and UNESCO have joined forces for the magnetic tape alert project, abbreviated MTAP. Now, the tool was a questionnaire in all 6 UN languages. It was concentrating on magnetic tape holdings only. It was asking for formats, contents, need of equipment, training, but also it asked for the readiness of well-established archives to assist sister collections. The result of the questionnaire, which was available earlier this year in July, brought 411 submissions. I'm not going to read all these details. Now, at the first look, it looks nice to unveil 8.4 million audio and video items. But if you look further down at the very end of this slide, you will see that there was a very uneven representation of respondents. There was a stronghold in Europe and the Americas, but there was little results were given from Africa, Asia, and Oceania. And out of the 193 UNESCO member states, only 76 countries responded. This was an unfortunate surprise. Now, in summarizing, however, one can say that the respondents are aware of the threat. However, most of them were unable to complete the transfer of their contents from the magnetic tape into safe digital repository because they had no funds, no trained personnel, and no equipment. Now, MTAP is not yet finished. This is an intermediate report, and I hope that through this presentation today, it will many of the holders of such collection will be reminded that they have something to do to rescue their magnetic tape original. Now, this interim report is published on YASA's website, and so it can be studied in detail. What remains to be done is awareness raising of obsolescence, because this is essential for machine readable documents, be they original analogs or digital. And the strategic recommendations I would bring forward in this event today is that NGOs as well as UNESCO should increase awareness raising through strengthened national and regional infrastructures. It would be simple and inexpensive if the MTAP questionnaire, which is available in 6 languages already, can be used from member states to assess their national situations. Let me finish with a mantra which some of you may have heard before. These magnetic tapes that have been recorded over the past 50, 60 years are the main primary sources of our present knowledge of the cultural and linguistic diversity of humankind. And many of these originals are still waiting to be safeguarded, as to date they still sit on their original tapes, and there was no safety copy made so far. If we miss to do this in time, yeah, we in the future would still be able to read tens of thousands of secondary publications about language, grammars, rituals, oral history, etc. But we would read only in texts about these originals, but we would be unable to view or to listen to them. And I think this is an unprecedented situation in the 5,000 years of document preservation, which is an unbearable thought. So look out to find still originals of cultural importance which are yet not secured. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dietrich. And a timely warning to a future that technology will face unless we do something about it. And I think very, very clearly we don't want to see a past that is silent and still. And so it behoves us to do something about this soon. But technology, which we've just been speaking about, doesn't exist on its own as an absolute. No, it needs to be amongst discussion and debate. So I'm very pleased to welcome our 3 dialogue contributors. And the first dialogue contributor is Iulia Tortolero Cervantes. And Iulia will speak to our 2 speakers. Iulia.
Hello, how are you, everybody? Thank you, Kevin. Well, thank you to UNESCO and to the organizers for your kind invitation. I would first point out the flexible, creative, and inspired workstation designed by our colleagues from Kadka project. I hope you visit us soon in our countries, specifically in Latin America and the Caribbean. You are welcome there. I also wish to recognize the persistent efforts of the Magnetic Tape Alert, an important awareness raising initiative which has taught us to assess and safeguard our audiovisual heritage at risk recorded between 1940 and 1990. I hope our speakers can tell us more about your next steps. In this session, I want to raise to all participants 2 policy statements that I will share now in my screen. Hold me a second. I lost my. No, I don't see it. Wait me a second, please. Sorry, it was lost in my desk.
Perhaps speak to them, Yolia, if you can't find them in the written form.
Well, okay. Great. Now, the policy statements I wish to share with you are basically the Sustainable Development Goal 16 referred to access to information in alignment with the Target 7 of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, related to increased access to multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster risk information and awareness to people by 2030. This is the basic statement, policy statement I wish to share with you today and discuss. To analyze the importance of documenting and assessing risks to prevent technological hazards before they turn into disasters, affecting preservation, access to information, and sustainability. The SDG and Sendai framework goals cited here also are closely related to the initiative launched this year by UNESCO and the Japanese Funds Trust, in which I collaborated to implement an online survey in 63 memory institutions from 30 countries. The survey was designed in terms of a multi-hazard risk assessment in documentary heritage. And for more information, UNESCO will soon publish a final report, and the findings will be analyzed during the second Memory of the World Global Policy Forum in 2021. I wonder if the speakers agree with me on the significant advances achieved during the past decades in approving national and international standards, tools, software, or storage solutions to produce, manage, and preserve electronic records. Today, in fact, we have enough guidelines to design and implement assessments on technological hazards. What is still needed, however, is to promote among memory institutions the importance of investing more time in documenting and sharing their achievements, failures, and irreversible damages occurred due to technology use. If we return back in time 30 years ago, audiovisuals began being recorded in technology information equipments, just as Dr. Schuller explained. And in 1990, also, many archives, libraries, and museums acquired their first computers, softwares, or scanners to store, preserve, design websites, and give access to their collections, experimenting with a variety of formats, devices, and disks in search for managing their records, saving information, but also losing data due to obsolescence. From this perspective, let me ask our speakers and participants, which challenges and consequences will we face in the short and long term if memory institutions continue racing against time, asking for more budget to stay up to date in technology, to digitize, preserve, and give online access to electronic and digital collections? Or to do home office, why not? To conclude, I please ask our speakers to give us more details on how the magnetic tape alert and the Kadka project could guarantee sustainability, promote risk reduction, preservation, and access to video recordings, digital projects, and electronic records in the following decade. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all.
Thank you, Yolia. As time is pushing us along, I'll ask our two speakers to hold that question in mind, which is a good question about risk and advancing technologies. And we'll go straight to our next dialogue contributor, Amanda Harris from the Pacific and Regional Archive for digital sources in endangered cultures. And in case you hadn't worked that out, that is named Paradisic. Amanda.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And thank you to our speakers for raising such important issues and their proposals for cost-effective solutions to digitisation and for highlighting the urgent need to address the digitisation of audiovisual heritage. Audiovisual heritage is also the main focus of our work at the Digital Archive Paradisic. As Kevin said, Paradisic is the Pacific and Regional Archive for digital sources in endangered cultures. And our collection of now audiovisual recordings of more than 1,200 languages from all over the world was listed in the UNESCO Australian Register of the Memory of the World in 2013. We have languages and cultural heritage material, including music and performance from all over the world, but in particular from the Pacific. And in fact, a quarter of the world's languages are from that Pacific region. I wanted to contribute to this discussion by highlighting Dietrich Schuller's reference to safe digital repositories, and especially those for small collections. One of the big challenges, in addition to the challenges of digitisation technologies, especially for these smaller institutions, is the issue of long-term sustainability of the digitised records. We, of course, don't want digital objects to become vulnerable to loss in the way that currently analogue audiovisual records are. And part of thinking about this, and one of the things we're thinking about in our ongoing collaborations between Paradisic and small local cultural centres throughout the Pacific and also beyond that area, is how we can support these both funding and technology support for sustainable storage, access and good description of digital objects so that their contextual information remains with those digital files. So the discussion point I wanted to bring here is about a question of infrastructure bridges between regional cultural centres and institutions and major institutions such as Paradisic, but also others around the world. There are funding challenges for all of us, especially in this long-term view of the maintenance of digital objects and of their descriptive information. But we also need to be thinking about technology solutions to support this safekeeping of intangible heritage records, both in their home communities and also in long-term digital archives. And one of the things we're always thinking about is how any records in major institutions can be always accessible to home communities, especially speaker communities throughout the world. So one of the challenges we're always thinking about addressing, and I'd be interested to hear any thoughts from our speakers about how we can be thinking about technology that also pursues standardized, scalable cataloguing solutions that ensure the preservation of audiovisual records, as well as their descriptive metadata in perpetuity and the access to this data for speaker communities. We have been developing some methods for distributed catalogues so that we can take smaller catalogue versions of our larger catalogue to those smaller communities to provide access to these records. And when we come to the discussion point, I'd be keen to hear the views of our speakers on this additional problem, not just digitisation, but also of developing the technologies and funding support for the long-term sustainability of both the digital objects and their contextual descriptions. Thanks very much, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I think the two questions that we've, or the two discussion points that have just been brought up speak to that comes after the digitization work, the management of information, either through technology and managing those risks or through the contextualizing and descriptive information. Would you like to briefly address those points, our two speakers, Dietrich and Gunther, before I ask our third contributor to speak? Very briefly, please. Gunther, you're going first.
Okay, I would say thank you very much for these questions and remarks. I think what we all see, and especially in the time of Corona, that funds are even less available as it was before. So it's a difficult time to navigate in projects or to improve the funding situation. Nevertheless, I think the proposal of this Kadka workstation for digitization is really an example how you can provide quality in the digitization process and reduce costs. More is probably not possible. So when the money is shrinking, then you have to reduce cost. And this is an approach that should be considered in improving the situation. Also from my experience in the South Pacific, when you have this many small units, right, of states and islands. So it would be a disaster if these historical documentary heritage would be lost, right? So it is probably for quite a number still time to save these values. And it's the same in the Caribbean states, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it should not be only the initiative of the small island development states, but maybe of the political body of the whole unit could strengthen the preservation and the documentary heritage, right, to prepare for next generations, right? So, well, I think the national standards, as Julia mentioned, I think that is, of course, also important, but most standards are also in place, but it comes at the end to qualification, capacity building, and the cost for equipment. So then the political, unfortunately, the political guidelines at that point don't help, right? So, but they are necessary, no doubt. Today, I think in the morning, it was also a very interesting presentation about the activities of the British Library on their digitization studios. And I think that was also a good linking point of our session to the morning. Thanks.
Thank you. Dietrich.
Yes, from my side, there are the two most important points are awareness raising, I've said it in my presentation, and cooperation. I have not said it in my presentation because I was very much looking forward for Amanda, who spoke about Paradisec. Paradisec is a very important project and describes very well how we could proceed. I have been actively engaged since the 1970s in consulting audiovisual collections. I should not necessarily say audiovisual archives in various countries and various continents. And the great problem was always that each and every institution was working for itself, yeah, trying to get development aid from some countries, but not share this with their colleagues in the same, not even in the same city. They often didn't even know that there were colleagues which were fighting with the same problems, but unsuccessfully. So this kind of, you smile, Günther, this was the situation in Khartoum in 1977. I can tell you stories, but I don't want to hold you up. It is the cooperation. Cooperation is necessary for achieving standards. Cooperation is also necessary for reducing cost. And I want to put one aspect into the debate which is not widely discussed. The professional service providers to date who have great experience with mass digitization of broadcast and television archives, they can offer transfers of also, of course, of academic materials at very attractive prices. This is costly, still costly, but it would still be cheaper than employing students and paying them almost nothing and working on a small scale for years and never ending the jobs. I finish here.
Thank you, Dietrich. I'd like to invite our third dialogue contributor, Frederick Mayer, President of FIAF, Director of Cinematheque Suisse, and a representative of the Coordinating Council of Audiovisual Archives Association. Frederick.
Thank you, Kevin. Sorry for the long title. Yes, I wanted to address two things to the Günther and Dietrich. First of all, for Günther question, I think that the project is obviously great and very useful for those countries where it's difficult to have a system to digitize images in a good way and in a good quality. My main concern, which also raised another problem, is what's happened after. Because as we know, in the digital era, the storage of digital contents is not a small issue, and it cost effective. It needs quality check, quality control, transfer, migration, electricity, which is sometimes can be an issue in some countries. So I think in the reflection of finding solutions which are sustainable and working on a long term for some kind of countries where that is difficult, I think the question of the storage of those digital creations is very, very important. And on the other hand, to answer or to have also a question to Dietrich, we noticed in our world, which is obviously in my case more directed to cinema. Obviously, we have films which are still well after 120 years, and we all know that video is quite a problem for us. But the main problem we have is also the technology. I mean, it's quite difficult to find a VHS reader on the market. It's quite difficult to find all these old video and sound recorder and machine to read again all these old tapes we can have in the various archives. So I'm wondering in which sense UNESCO, for example, can help to find a way of cooperation internationally to raise the awareness also on the techniques of the machines, and not only on the tape itself, but on the machine, which permits to read again those tapes and to make those transfer. I heard what you said just now about mass transfer, which is always possible, but sometimes we don't have enough mass transfer to do, and the quality of the work we have might require a more personalized work for which we need the machine to reread it and to transfer it in a good conditions. So, well, that was my two main questions I want to raise, and thank you to all.
Okay. To our speakers, do you wish to respond? Dietrich, Günther? We need your microphone on, Dietrich.
if I may say, I cannot read. There are so many questions. This would need a specific event on that, and that's what I would like to take up. This is the first first bigger online event organized by the CI sector, which I work for the CI sector since 30 years now. And it would be good if we could go on in this way and discuss all these important questions which Frederick has said now and which cannot be dealt with in this environment today in a special event. I think we should all opt for that. Thank you.
May I just add that CCAAA, which I represent here, will be probably very happy to follow up on this question. And you know, Yaza is member also of CCAAA, though, with pleasure.
I was representing UNESCO IFAB in CCAAA for many years. I'm aware we should try it.
I know.
Okay.
Yeah, when I am allowed to respond shortly to Frederick, I think it is totally correct that the digitization is only the starting point, and then we should do the next technical steps for accessibility and visibility of all these documents we have digitized. The university, for example, what I mentioned in Karlsruhe, they are privileged, right? It is just a research project and they upgrade a lot of storage at their computation center, right? But it is totally different in the case of Africa or in the case of South Sudan, right? So first, it will also be stored locally, but on the demand, depending on the demand, right? There might be also other solutions like cloud or whatever. You have different providers there, and also you have to look at the cost, right? The other question is what I addressed is maybe there is really also a broad need for a MOOC where you can address all these questions, right, together. What are the state-of-the-art ideas? What are the examples? And what can you do in different development situations? I think that would be very useful. And maybe the CI sector is behind such ideas. Thanks.
Thank you. I have two questions from the audience, and they're both addressed to Dietrich and to do with magnetic tape. So though we're pretty well right out of time, I will ask the questions and if you can respond, Dietrich. One is about the magnetic tapes held by individuals and families rather than within institutions. Is there anything that can be put in place to collect and transfer information from tapes held by individuals? And the second question is about MTAP. Is there cooperation with some African countries? And if so, which ones?
Not understand the first question, but Kevin, may you answer the first question, because I'm sure we have the same knowledge about it. I couldn't understand the question.
Okay, the question was, what can be put in place to ensure the tapes that are held by individuals are preserved, as opposed to the tapes held by universities or archives? And I think this speaks to your paper, which is we need to have a national and a wide-ranging effort to ensure that collections of individuals' tapes are acquired and preserved. And I think Paradisec is a great example of that, as they work with various academics who hold tapes and recordings of significance. And so I think the answer to that is cooperative arrangements. The second question, though, which is there cooperation with some African countries for the Magnetic Tape Alert project? And if so, which countries?
I'm not aware of any specific projects in Africa which would be regional in a wider sense. There are several projects which are often supported by the former colonial states, specifically in the communauté which are the former French countries in Africa.
Can't hear you, Kevin.
Hello?
My apologies for muting the microphone. We have one last question. What types of support exist for those institutions that safeguard historical collections and cannot digitize their archives due to technological obsolescence?
Cooperation with specifically and start with national cooperation, and you will find out that 80% of the solution is already existent in the country, but it does not work because people often even know each other or they don't like each other. I'm sorry to say this.
And I will also add to that organisations such as YASO and Fiat and indeed FIAF and others have training programs and support mechanisms to help people prepare to find ways to find those solutions as well. Well, I think our time has definitely come to an end. I'd like to thank our two speakers and our three contributors and hand over to Natasha. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bradley, and the participants of this quite insightful discussion and the passionate call for action, considering the immediate threat of digital obsolescence. I would like to now announce that the next part of our program is a 5-minute break. During the break, there will be displays of UNESCO Memory of the World International Register and information about the rest of the program. So please come back in 5 minutes for our next topic on the legal frameworks in digital preservation after the break. Thank you. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to session 2 of the UNESCO Policy Dialogue on Digital Preservation. We will now continue with the second topic, focusing on legal frameworks essential for digital preservation policies. It is my pleasure to introduce Ms. Ingrid Perron, who will be moderating this session. Ms. Ingrid Perron is University Librarian Emerita at the University of British Columbia. She is former president of IFLA and member of the Preservation Subcommittee. Ms. Perron is chair of the UNESCO Persist Content Task Force that released UNESCO guidelines for the selection of digital documentary heritage. The guidelines are translated in multiple languages and widely distributed by UNESCO and practitioners. May I invite Ms. Perron to introduce the topic and the participants.
Well, thank you, Natasha, and hello to everyone. I'm very pleased to be your moderator for this session, which focuses on the legal framework that is or should be in place to enable and facilitate the essential activity of digital preservation. In my experience, the need to preserve our documentary heritage, whether analog or digital, is a hard sell. It's a hard sell even to cultural heritage institutions, including libraries, archives, and museums, which given limited resources, generally favor building collections and providing access to information for their users over preservation. It's a hard sell to the private sector, information producers, corporations, technology providers, who favor their business interests over keeping track of their older productions and ensuring their long-term utility. But especially, preservation is a hard sell to governments who have to balance many competing interests if they wish to continue to function and to remain in power. And preservation is not high on the list of priorities for governments, especially in this time of a pandemic, when digital technologies are being used to their maximum to provide services and to connect people, just like this Zoom call, to keep our society functioning. And yet governments are key because they have the real power to make digital preservation a reality. They have legislative powers to enforce the selection and preservation of digital materials for long-term access. They also have powers of persuasion to cause changes in behavior, and they have the fiscal power to support an effective digital preservation program. So what are some of the legislative policies and strategies that need to be developed and assessed in order to advance the work of digital preservation around the world? We are delighted that Mr. Eric Chin will be our main speaker today. Eric Chin has been General Counsel at the National Library Board in Singapore since 2012 and was previously General Counsel at the National Heritage Board and State Counsel at the Attorney General's Chambers. He has 2 degrees, one in law and one in library and information studies. And he currently serves on both ICA's expert group on legal matters, as well as on IFLA's Committee on Copyright and Legal Matters. So Mr. Chin, the screen is now yours.
Thank you, Ingrid. Hello, everybody. With that introduction, I think I need to first and foremost say that I'm going to speak to a topic that I do get quite excitable over. And in part because of that, I need to emphasize that I don't speak in an official capacity today. And I would like to share with you as part of a member of this, ecosystem of people interested in archives, libraries, and information. So I wanted to talk today about one of the key legal issues. There are many, but the key legal issues pertaining to digital preservation, and that we can focus on copyright law. I have often felt that the word copy or copying needs to almost be whispered in the corridors of archives and libraries, because quite often when we talk about it, we're talking about it in the context of did we do this in the correct way, or did we accidentally do something that's illegal? So it can be frightening as such in some aspects of it. And then quite often at international meets like these, we hear about the efforts at WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, to come up with a treaty, a comprehensive one that would cover the kind of copyright exceptions that archives and libraries need in order to do their work, in order to preserve things better, in order to give more access so that learning, and research can happen. But that talk at WIPO has been going on for something like 10 years now. Nothing seems to have moved very much. And so we seem to be within a topic that is quite distant and seems quite difficult. Today, I want to try to unpack some of that and ask 3 questions in terms of why, what, and how. I start with the why, and I'm very grateful for so many colleagues today who have laid the foundation for that, so I can go very quickly into why copying is essential for libraries and archives and why it is something good when it comes to digital preservation, right? So we have heard that you have unique archives, you have rare publications, handling can damage them, some of them are fragile. If you make a digital copy, as mentioned by our Dutch colleague earlier, you can give access in a different way that will safeguard the original. We have natural disasters, man-made disasters. Unfortunately, we have wars that destroy original archives and artifacts. If that which is destroyed, if a copy had not been made, if a surrogate had not been made, that the content of what is destroyed is lost forever from humankind. It's just lost forever. So it's essential as far as possible for copies to be made of original archives and artifacts. And then we have heard so much about the audiovisual. I don't need to say more except that it is really a race against time. And by, I think most readings I've come across, you maybe have 10 years left to try to digitize the magnetic tapes, for example, perhaps even less time than that, because nobody's building those machines anymore to read the magnetic tapes. And then, of course, you come to present day situation, the new documentary heritage, social media, websites, and so on. This is part of the new heritage, so to speak, but they are very ephemeral. They come and go at a click of a button, it disappears. So you can't wait for copyright to be over, the monopoly period for copyright to be over to capture and collect and preserve this new documentary heritage. You have to do it sooner than later. And that involves copying. And finally, as our keynote speaker noted, and many others I think have done so as well, the technology cycles come so quickly. Once you have something in the digital format, you need to migrate it every 10, maybe you stretch it 20 years. And so again, that involves copying. So my first suggestion to the audience today is that copying is good. Copying is good for the purposes of digital preservation, which must be done and must be done urgently for the reasons that I've tried to share, and I think others have shared today. But how does a library or archives or other information institutions, how can they do this copying that they need to do for digital preservation? My suggestion is, of course, we need clear laws that allow for that, right? So in some countries, you have laws such as the principles of fair use and fair dealing, which are certain defenses within the copyright regime. Those are useful, but there are many gray areas with regard to that. They don't specifically deal with preservation. And so you always have to make an argument that you fit within the framework of fair use or fair dealing within your country. And that frankly gives me gray hairs all the time. Colleagues come to me all the time asking, we want to do this. Are we within the realm of fair use? Are we within the realm of fair dealing? And so many lawyers as myself working in information institutions, many national archivists, many national librarians have to make that very difficult judgment call in a very, very gray area. So that is not ideal. There ought to be clear laws on digital preservation that can be done. The great thing about this is that many countries have done that, right? So it's not rocket science as such. It is not something that is not done before. Many countries have done it. Many countries have put in place laws to where a certain national institution can take anything that's broadcasted, can collect websites and so on. So I can't go into examples today. Time is short, but those laws are in place in many countries. So for those countries that do not yet have them, you will have case studies out there, you have best practices out there that you can follow or copy from. And one thing I need to emphasize here is that we don't have to wait for an international treaty to happen before you can go and advocate for your own local laws, right? Quite often we are waiting on whether this international treaty at WIPO will come out, but there's more than one way of doing this, and local laws can be enacted with or without the WIPO treaty. I'm not saying that the treaty is a bad thing. It's still something that many believe is a good thing to do. Others believe that better licensing schemes are the way to go, but that's to be discussed at WIPO. My own take is that any which approach, or maybe a combination of them, can bring us to the right solution. And certainly we have the Marrakesh Treaty at WIPO to do with the ability to transfer and reproduce more to help those who are impaired in terms of hearing. And that is an example of how a treaty can well work, but we don't have to wait for a treaty. Many countries have gone ahead and put in local legislation that allow them to do digital preservation. On that point, I just want to say that quite often people come unstuck, whether at the treaty level or at local legislation level, when, as we have heard today, right? So if you spend money and you collect and you preserve on the one hand, and let's say you have laws, you say, I want to have laws on that, and you are able to get your government or your policy, those in charge of policy to agree to that. But then we often say that once we do this, we also want to give access, we want to give use to people. But that use and access can be at this level, or some lower level, right? And so there's always that balance to be discussed with publishers and creators and so on. And we mustn't also underplay the importance of their rights, and their legitimate rights to benefits to their creative works. So, but quite often, I think that the two are put together, this laws on preservation and the laws on use. And when the disagreement happens in relation to the laws of use and access, the whole thing comes crashing down. What I would like, the policy position as such, I'd like to suggest is, if you are in the position to advocate for such laws at your local level, in your country, if you're able to get the laws on preservation, take it, it's a bird in hand. If you're not collecting in the first place, you're not able to make that copy of that magnetic tape now, you can go and discuss use and access for the next 10 years, and you have lost the chance to preserve some very valuable content. So I'd like to look at them as two different things, and that balance and discussion with creators and publishers, let it take its time that it needs, because that will take a bit more time. And as I said, there are legitimate interests there as well. And lastly, So the how is you need laws in place, and some countries already have them. Lastly, what can UNESCO do? Perhaps what can international organizations do? And I'll do this very quickly. I know I'm out of time. We often talk about what we want to do, the desires, the wishes, the general principles that we aspire towards, and so on. But we don't often actually share the precise case studies, the best practices. So I would love it if we could really draw the examples of countries that have come up with their own legislation, put this up somewhere and show them to the world and say, look, this is your choice of the types of legislation that will allow you to do digital preservation without the need to go and wait for some treaty to happen. And with that, I think I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chin, for that overview of why copying is good for digital preservation and what we can do.
Ingrid, I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Can I do it? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. You saw my lips. Okay, thank you very much, Eric, for that overview of copying and why it's a good thing to do for digital preservation. We have two dialogue contributors to continue the discussion. First, we have Soledad Abaca. She is the head of the photographic and audiovisual collections at the National Library of Chile. She's also a member of the Memory of the World National Committee, and she has coordinated the IFLA Preservation and Conservation Center in Chile. So she will present a few remarks, very few minutes, and ask a question of our previous speaker, depending on the time. So Soledad, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Eric, for the great presentation. I would like to begin by briefly thanking UNESCO for having the opportunity to participate in this important dialogue, and also greet all of those who work with audiovisual heritage. This is a field that demands a lot of commitment and passion. This day help us to meet and support each other in this task. When I was invited to propose this policy statement, I thought about the reality of my region, Latin America, where we deal with a number of threats for the documentary heritage. As you may know, lots of natural disasters, economic and political crises, to name some of them. Maybe my proposals are more focused on the safeguarding of collections, because I believe we're really behind in that race that Eric mentioned. So my first proposal was to establish a strong policy of preservation and access for the audiovisual heritage in the long term that ensures the survival of the institutions that carry out this task. The difficult reality in some institutions demonstrate the legal fragility in which this area is immersed. The most emblematic case is the well-known crisis of the Cinemateca Brasileira, which is going on for several years, and its future still remains uncertain, despite many protests and international pleas for its protection. Some countries have removed their ministries of culture, and some others, such as Chile, have a new one with 2 years old, and the heritage law is being discussed in the parliament, so might be a good time for raising these problems. My second idea of policy statement is to establish or strengthen legal frameworks such as deposit law, that ensure preservation and digital access in specialized institutions. The fragility of audiovisual media and its technological obsolescence demands a stronger preservation, especially an access policy. In some countries, there are no institutions dedicated, for example, to radio and television heritage as public assets, leaving that responsibility to private broadcasters, which most of the time don't care about preservation. All the work with AV, like photographic collections, sound and moving image, requires a high and permanent resources and specialized staffs, which is why policies are required to support the management of this heritage. Today, with the economic and political crisis, most countries have made important budget cuts in the cultural area. On the other hand, and finally, the existing legal framework in most cases is old and outdated. In Chile, for example, our legal deposit is from 1925, has little updates, but still very old. It incorporates audiovisual media, but institutions like National Library don't have the infrastructure to receive it, so it's still like a dream. That would be my few remarks, and then I would like to ask Eric how we can raise our voice and convince governments to develop legislation for national institutions or other institutions to ensure the preservation of audiovisual material. You talk about a little bit, so if you've seen experiences in other countries.
I think Ingrid actually touched a little bit on the complexity of that issue in terms of governments having to balance budgets, ensure their own re-elections and things like that, complex issues. It may seem harsh, but I often like to look at ourselves as the institution and what we can do and to sell ourselves better, so to speak. And the thing that appears to me to work best in many countries, based on discussions with colleagues as well as personal experience, would be to show an example, to prioritize a project where you can show why, you can show to the policy makers or the politicians and the government why a preservation is important, how we can speak to the people. So I would say politicians, policymakers, and the people at large, right? So the politicians and policymakers, if they see that the people at large are excited and there's a positive reaction from whether it's an exhibition, social media blitz, whatever it is, that's how I think that is the kind of buy-in that we need to start the ball rolling, to say there is really good to be had in this. It is something that brings the people together, brings communities together, and that is something valuable for the country. And that is the kind of message that must be sold in order for culture to be prioritized and heritage and culture to be prioritized. It's not easy, but it starts with one politician who is interested, and then you grow that ecosystem. Perhaps it can start at the local level, and then regional, and then at the country level. But it's always a step-by-step process for many of these things.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. And thank you, Soledad. We have one last dialogue contributor who has a few minutes to speak about the issue. He is Mr. Maximilian Skrivanek. He is an historian and an archivist, and his current position is Director of the National Archives of Curaçao. So, Mr. Skrivanek, please.
Thank you, Ingrid. And thank you, Eric, for your presentation. So copying is good, like Eric said, but you need some firm rules. I like to put forward an argument which starts where copyrights are fading. So where copyrights fade into, for example, open access licenses. You've mentioned one of them in your speech, the FAIR license. The argument is, should we strengthen custodianship in relation to the rules of provenance? And this is a genuine concern of the Caribbean region, a genuine concern of CARBICA, the Caribbean branch of the International Council on Archives. And let me elaborate on this argument. Europe has adopted open access policy for digitized content. Copyrights or other barriers for copying or reusing digitized material are reduced and replaced with open licenses. This is applicable for all forms of scientific output, but also for databases or indeed cultural heritage. So it also is applicable for the national archives of our Caribbean region. It's done with the best intentions. So you create a knowledge-based economy, etc. But it's the concern is that if Caribbean countries, which all have historical relations to Europe, almost all countries are former colonies of European countries. So there's a lot of mutual heritage, and if these, we've seen in the past few years that based on provenance, archival holdings were reallocated from Europe to the Caribbean. This is in the case, for example, with Suriname. Right now, we see an opposite direction with digitized content. So digitized content is reallocated from the Caribbean to Europe, where there are more resources, there are more universities, where there is the index software, etc., the know-how to make databases, etc. So this and these are databases that's really about the people of the Caribbean, like digitized deeds of the civil registry or slave registers, as in the case with Curacao and Suriname. So there's a concern that the custodianship of these records are under European jurisdictions, if it's hosted in Europe, and free for reuse for every application maker in Europe. So there's an issue with custodianship, and my question would be, should we strengthen these licenses, the open access license, with an issue of provenance? So at least adjust the license agreements in such a way that any issues, disputes coming out from these reuse of data is admitted by the courts of the country where the originals are situated. So again, strengthening the provenance rules. So if this is done, should we, and this is a second question, do we need a provenance trail for a user to make an independent judgment about origins, authenticity, or reliability of a digital content?
If I don't know, Ingrid?
Yes, go ahead, Eric, but 1 minute, that's all.
Okay, then I'll take the second one first. Very quickly, I think it's basic archival practice in a way that hopefully anyone who takes any custody of any archives, digitized or otherwise, would make sure that the indicators and markers of the provenance are there, whether it's in the metadata or certainly in digital files. There's the ability to actually put in that marker that will tell you that where this is from and so on, the provenance and so actually there's the ability within digital files to hark back to the originals, so to speak. So that link can be done by proper archival practices. Coming to the second issue, I think that's a bit more tricky about, I think it was discussed in earlier today as well, about archives that have to, where there are partnerships, sometimes collaborations where archives from one country are digitized in another and sometimes made available through another institution or another country, so to speak. My own sense is ultimately that has to come down to the contract that is negotiated, but I understand totally that the challenges are there when if there's challenges of funding in the country's origin, and then there's someone willing somewhere else to digitize and put them up and preserve them. There's that challenge of when to sign off on a contract and when to push further and look for another partner. Yeah, so I think that's all I can deal with right now. We can dialogue offline later or maybe at some other seminar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maximilian, for your review of the Caribbean situation, and for Eric for answering those questions. I wonder, are there any questions from the audience now? Do we have any time? I don't think we have time. Okay, we are over time already. So thank you all for listening for a great panel. And my last message is keep advocating for digital preservation to your governments. And now I will turn it over to the last session, which is the lock note session. Natasha or Adam?
Thank you, Ingrid. Participants for this comprehensive and truly informative session, highlighting the intricate issues at the intersection of legal and preservation aspects that must be carefully considered. We should now proceed to the last part of our program, which is the lock note session. And I will for a moment just to share my screen. Yes. The lock note session is on preservation policy challenges, and the moderator for this session will be Mr. Adam Farquhar. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Adam Farquhar, who will be the moderator and who is the founding partner at the Digital Lifecycle Management. Mr. Farquhar has held senior management roles at the British Library, where he directed the Endangered Archives programs and managed major British library collections areas. Collaborating with the broader preservation community, Mr. Farquhar founded DataSite and the Open Preservation Foundation. May I invite Mr. Farquhar to introduce the lock note and the participants. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Natasha. So Natasha gave me a challenge of putting together some of the key points from today before handing off to the session speakers. So early on, David framed the day effectively by outlining 4 challenge areas. Right, so there's identity, and I was really struck by the growth of the strong, articulate international voices that ring with deep knowledge around Indigenous data sovereignty. Excellent projects such as the Missions Connect project that we heard about provide concrete experience that can really effectively inform policy as we move forward. I think the discussion also highlighted the importance of walking with community members as their willingness to share their stories with others changes during their life's journey. In the sustainability section, it highlighted that sustainability requires working in collaboration. And ensuring awareness beyond one's own immediate organization and community. We heard about how the Dutch National Library places a network of organizations at the heart of its thinking about preservation. We heard how these networks reach across to peers, upwards through government, and deeply involve the people who hold, value, and use collections. We also heard an important perspective on digital infrastructure, which is that the challenge in some areas is its complexity, but in others, it's actually its absence. After the long break, we came back to the technology section, and we learned about some capabilities that are emerging that really help to accelerate training and capacity building, while at the same time lowering the cost of digital capture. And this is making a profound difference to what's possible and where it's possible. On World Audio Video Heritage Day, we quite rightly heard about audiovisual material and magnetic tape and the way that it's becoming a global crisis, an acute crisis. And we have a raw responsibility for preservation of audiovisual material on magnetic tape, even when immediate access to the results of that preservation may not be possible. And I'll just note, so I used to be responsible for AV collections at the British Library. There's an interesting risk around equality of access when well-funded organizations perhaps buy up and collect replay equipment, leaving collections elsewhere at greater risk. And finally, in the law section, Eric Chen gave what I thought was an exceptionally clear outline of a very complex topic. And he called on UNESCO to bring together and promulgate best practices in legal approaches to enabling copying for preservation, and perhaps decoupling that from access, use, and international treaties. So in this session, we'll hear from three important perspectives: from UNESCO, from the International Council of Archives, and from the International Federation of Library Associations. We're especially interested in hearing about how we can move forward and how the leading global organizations like UNESCO can establish and foster meaningful new policies and continue to provide global leadership in this area. We've got three contributors to this session. I'm just going to give them a heads up. We had said I'd introduce all three of them, but I'm judging from the way the sessions have been going, it's better to introduce them one at a time. So I'm going to start with our first speaker, Faxin Banda. Faxin is the chief of the Documentary Heritage Unit at UNESCO, the one that manages the Memory of the World program. He served at UNESCO for almost a decade, working on media literacy, journalism education, and media development. In 2008, he was the recipient of the MISA Press Freedom Award and was previously chair of Media and Democracy in the School of Journalism and Media Studies at Rhodes University. And as a scholar, his work touched on a wide range of highly relevant to today's discussion topics, including African political thought and media, post-colonial theory and media, technology and development, civic education and communications. So with that by way of introduction, Faxin, if I can turn the microphone and the screen over to you.
Perfect. So let me just share my screen. So what I want to talk about is how the 2015 recommendation concerning the preservation of and access to documentary heritage, including in digital form, has been implemented by UNESCO member states. It is important to highlight that because it demonstrates the intergovernmental framework within which the discussions that we are having here play out. And so I will start, first of all, with an outline of the 2015 recommendation for those that may not be so familiar with it. And then I will very quickly move on to look at the key policy issues that have emerged from a member states' national reporting on the implementation of this particular recommendation. So moving on to the first point then, the recommendation was adopted in 2015 by the UNESCO General Conference. What that means is that it is now an intergovernmental standard setting instrument for safeguarding documentary heritage across 5 key areas, namely identification, preservation, access, and 2 others, which I have put in red because I just want to signal the fact that these speak more to the issue of enabling environments, you do require a policy framework within which you can identify, preserve, and access documentary heritage. And linked to that is the question of cooperation, whether that occurs at the national or international level. Moving on then, what this recommendation does is that it provides a reporting framework whereby every 4 years, member states report on the action undertaken to give effect to the recommendation. And for the purpose of this discussion, there are 5 key data categories for the reporting, which include general support for documentary heritage. Many of the presentations have touched on that to varying degrees. Legislation and mandates, which I would develop a little bit further in terms of the findings that we got from the consolidated report, as well as identification and preservation status of documentary heritage, capacity building, again, an issue that has been addressed by several presentations here, and of course, the status of the Memory of the World program in each of our member states that have such a program linked to their ministries through either national commissions for UNESCO or national committees of the Memory of the World program. Having said that, then, in terms of some of the statistics that we've got, 38 countries submitted such reports, broken down as follows. You had Group 1 there with 11 member states, Group 2, 12 member states, Group 3, 4, Group 4, 6, Group 5A, 2, and Group 5B, 3. Now that, of course, is indicative of the gap that is there between the developed countries and the developing countries, particularly in Africa. And that is an issue that speaks to the need for international solidarity, international cooperation across the 5 areas that the recommendation deals with. So then, in trying to conclude my remarks, what I want to do is to capture some of the key policy issues that have emerged from the consolidated reporting. And these issues, like I noted earlier on, are going to be largely about legislation and mandates, and then also the status of preservation and accessibility. So focusing on the first rubric then, it would appear that most member states have a legislative framework for formulating policies to safeguard documentary heritage. But what is important to underline is that documentary heritage is addressed in laws and regulations that relate to cultural heritage in general. So there is a degree of specificity that is required. And I think that even when we talk about copyright laws, we are indeed calling for that specificity. But also, one might argue that in terms of economic sustainability, the budget allocated by most member states for memory institutions has increased overall, with the European Union driving this increase for European countries. But yes, gaps still exist in poorer countries, and this, to me, signals a need for solidarity. There was, in the consolidated report, a pre-COVID-19 commitment by member states to a long-term investment in digitization infrastructure and preservation of digital archives. And I think that this pre-COVID-19 commitment needs to be upheld now more than ever. Thirdly, with respect to legislation and mandates, as for technology, the development of open source software and access to proprietary codes is ongoing in several states, whereas it is not yet established in others. At the same time, digital migration from analog media formats poses a problem for cataloging, access, and preservation, especially in poorer countries. If I might move on very, very quickly to the arena of identification and preservation status of documentary heritage. There, what we have noticed among our member states is that most national memory institutions are governed by preservation and access policies, criteria and rules for selecting and acquiring materials, as well as rules for deselecting. This seems to come across all the reports that we received, but bear in mind that this is just 38 member states are reporting, and we cannot therefore generalize to the entire population of the UNESCO member states. Moving on, with the challenge of deterioration or permanent loss, most states have identified specific parts of collections of memory institutions that are at potential risk, and they've prioritized these for preservation and digitization. Related to this, member states are reinforcing measures for the rescue and protection of endangered documentary heritage, committing to the research of protection techniques, and creating constructive and collaborative mechanisms to mitigate the risks faced by vulnerable collections through sharing knowledge, guidance, and so on and so forth. And I think that many of the presentations have captured this particular aspect very beautifully. Finally, although very few states report that they cannot support private, local, and individual collections, an issue which has been raised by one of the questioners during this particular session, most states see the value in doing so. And the consolidated report provides a list of examples where member states are committing themselves to this. In particular, countries like Canada have got enhanced digitization of local collections. The UK's Discovery platform is also key in terms of documenting the nation's heritage. And as we had, of course, this morning, indigenous peoples' cultural heritage is also upheld in countries like Australia. So it seems to me then, in summing up, that many of the issues that have sort of been raised today do find resonance among our member states, particularly if you look at the summary of the findings that I've just given you. On that note, I would like to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Faxon. So our second speaker then will be David Frick. He provided our keynote earlier today. David's president of the International Council of Archives. David, if you can turn on your video. He's also the vice chair of the UNESCO Memory of the World International Advisory Committee and Director General of the National Archives of Australia. David?
Thank you very much, Adam, for that introduction again, and thank you also, Faxon. And as I said at the keynote, thank you to you, in particular, Faxon, for hosting this event. My reflections, I suppose, really do flow on from the outline that we've just heard from Faxon, and in particular the point you made there, Faxon, about we do need that policy framework. And I think it's good to revisit that framework around those principal areas of selection, preservation, and access, and what that means for us as we organise our policy priorities going forward, particularly with the sphere of digital preservation, and again, with reference to the recommendation, the 2015 recommendation concerning documentary heritage. So if I can speak from the perspective of the International Council on Archives, the ICA, the takeaways that I have, that I believe I should take back with me to the ICA and through our work within Memory of the World Preservation Subcommittee, is around the areas of selection. I think the magnetic tape alert project that we've discussed is, I think, an excellent example of where we need to prioritise selection to make sure that the heritage which is at risk of loss is being picked up in our selection priorities to make sure that we're not losing the opportunity to incorporate those aspects of documentary heritage into our collective memory. I think that the last discussion on the provenance trail that Maximilian raised, for example, dealing with colonial, post-colonial heritage, shared archival heritage, I think is very pertinent here as well. And I think that was a very powerful discussion in terms of identifying who has, if you like, standing in the provenance of digital documentary heritage, and how that should be incorporated into that part of our policy framework. Around access, if I can go there, I think the discussions from this morning's session on data sovereignty, and as we start to build up virtual heritage collections, and we reflect upon those Indigenous communities, but all communities that require sovereignty over the control of the collection, the access, the description, the value, the cultural significance of heritage. If we are to see that through the world view of the Indigenous communities that created that heritage, the concept I heard this morning for the first time was digital trespass. And just as we would respect physical access to built heritage and have concepts of trespass onto a built heritage, I think we do need to deal with that now in the documentary heritage. And I think data sovereignty, digital trespass, I think are very important aspects going forward in our access policy framework. In preservation, we had some really, really fascinating presentations around that. I thought the Kadka presentation from Gunther, I think was fascinating. We had discussions also about the need for more partnerships, for more collaboration, for combining our resources. And I think ICA here we can continue to do more to make sure that all of the resources that we have as an international community, and in keeping with the call to action from the 2015 recommendation, we can always do more to pool our resources to make sure that we are building bridges across infrastructure, across knowledge and resources, so that issue of sustainability, which comes up over and over again, once we've digitized something, once we have rescued content, how do we sustain the preservation? How do we sustain that access, and how do we sustain the authorities and sovereignty issues? I actually think there's a lot more to be done now on sustainability. We all know that preservation doesn't finish. Preservation keeps going. Preservation is an ongoing action to make sure that heritage is kept in an accessible form. And so I think for me, it's that issue of sustainability. And if we can find long-term sustainable platforms for digital preservation, for all of the work that Paradisec is doing, that we're doing with Kadka workstations, etc., I think those platforms for sustainable preservation, I think, are going to become very, very important. And all of that, thanks to your presentation, Eric, Chin, all of this is underpinned by what the message there is: a pragmatic, practical approach to our advocacy for legislative reform. If we try and do everything in one step, and Eric, I think you summed it up so well, if we try and argue about those access to material which has some copyright issues around it, then we might lose traction on our discussions about preservation. So I think if we have a more nuanced, more sophisticated discussion about legislative reform, and we separate out selection, preservation and access, I think we have some really good leads out of this session today on how we might take those legal issues forward. I've spoken for way too long, but there is a great deal to unpack and to digest from the sessions today. So Adam, thank you very much for that opportunity. And I look forward to prosecuting all of these matters through the Preservation Subcommittee and within ICA. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, David. And then our final speaker will be Helen Vincent. Helen serves on the IFLA Governing Board and is chair of its Cultural Heritage Program Advisory Committee. She was chair of IFLA's Rare Books and Special Collections section and part of the working group that produced IFLA's guidelines for setting up digital reunification projects. As her day job, she's head of Rare Books, Maps, and Music Collections at the National Library of Scotland. Helen, if you turn on your video.
Thanks, Adam.
Great.
Thanks to everybody for such an inspiring and stimulating program. No one event can possibly cover every issue relating to the 4 topics we've addressed today. So I would like to remind us of some issues which I did not see named in our program today, although it's a tribute to how thoughtful and full our presentations have been, that in fact some of these have been talked about, these which must be considered as factors in the practical and policy answers to questions of cultural identity at risk, economic sustainability, technology, and legal frameworks. The first is one that I did not hear so much about, and that is environmental sustainability. Increasingly, when we talk about digital preservation, this is something that we must factor in. Several of our presenters today talked about how climate change puts our collections at risk, but we must also consider how some of the solutions that are being put forward to that problem might affect our digital preservation. For instance, legislation about a sustainable environmental footprint. Digital depends on electricity. Digital preservation of documentary heritage needs to form part of the national and international conversation about climate change and environmental sustainability. Secondly, digital preservation does not need to be online. In countries where there is the risk of violent destruction of documentary heritage or the threat of natural disaster, digital preservation in the form of multiple digital copies securely stored on hardware, the digital equivalent of evacuating physical collections to remote caves, can be a vital way to preserve heritage. Digital access can also be offline, and embedding that in our policy frameworks can be one way to address the question raised in the first session today about the inequalities of internet access and lack of high quality bandwidth around the world. Thirdly, on the question of access as well as copying and survival, the principle of the right to access embedded in policy needs also to consider what are appropriate restrictions. And here I would like to connect what we heard so movingly in our first session and so eloquently about access to Indigenous cultural heritage and respecting, as David says, this notion of digital trespass, with issues about information and data and the right to privacy. I think that we can advocate more strongly for both of these issues if we put them together and talk about how the individual right to data privacy relates to the right to respect for Indigenous culture and communities. No one's data, no one's identity, no one's culture should be stolen from them, and everyone has the right to be forgotten, whether that is the right as regards cultural issues, so movingly expressed in our first presentation, or the very dry and technical aspect enshrined in European data legislation. Secondly, I'd like to remind our audience that where you are without current policy and legislative frameworks or are currently advocating for them, IFLA and the International Council on Archives can provide valuable advice and support for library and archive professionals and for anyone who has to deal with the care and preservation of documentary heritage. And I'll just remind you, you can find so much information about this on our websites and also get involved. And I'll put some links in the chat for people who might be interested in getting involved with the work of IFLA, for instance, our professional units relating to digital preservation. And I'll draw attention to the work of IFLA's Preservation and Conservation Strategic Programme and the expertise of our PAC centres around the world. Our PAC centre based at the National Library of Poland leads on digital preservation, but we have several other centres around the world which provide advice and expertise. And you heard from the director of our Chile centre earlier today. Through IFLA's Register for Documentary Heritage at Risk, which we plan to expand and develop in the coming year, IFLA hopes to be a close partner with the Memory of the World in terms of information exchange, rapid response to situations that might further endanger collections, and through developing tools to build capacity for preservation of documentary heritage collections. Please look out for a promotional campaign around this register in the coming year and a suite of tools developed with it, which will enable better care for collections and advocacy for them at national level. And finally, since I'm the last panelist today, I'd like to say thanks to Faxon and the team at UNESCO for putting together this event today, and to David for your work in putting it together as well, and how pleased we are that this event is taking place. We've worked together on the issue of digital preservation for many years, and we're keen to continue growing this relationship. I think if we could ask for one thing from IFLA, it is that we are inspired by our past history of working together and the leverage that this cooperation gives us to be bold and persistent in what we ask of others. Simply bringing people together, governments, professionals, and the IT sector and the commercial companies, which, as David mentioned in his keynote, are currently selecting, preserving, and disseminating so much of our past and present cultural heritage. By bringing us all together, we can find better answers to the problems of digital preservation. We often leave the big tech companies out when we talk about cultural matters, and I think they need to be included in our conversation.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you.
Before I close this session and pass the microphone back to Natasha, Faxon, would you like to take a final minute to comment or respond?
Perhaps. We taking on board all the issues that have been raised, and in particular the takeaways that my two colleagues have highlighted. I wanted to share with you a project that's in the pipeline, which is to publish a manual of sorts on digitization. UNESCO is focusing on digitization a lot more now, given what we have learned from COVID-19. And initially, we had wanted this manual to be used by our colleagues in field offices to manage digitization projects. But listening to you, throughout the day, I'm getting the idea that perhaps it might be useful to link this publication to the discussions that we've had, perhaps to have a collection of best practices on low cost digital preservation, including the legal issues that underpin that, as well as the technologies that could potentially drive it, particularly in Africa and small island developing states. So this is something that, by way of a concrete outcome, I would argue might take these conversations forward. So I'm very grateful, that we had this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So, David.
Do you mind terribly, just before we do hand over to Natasha, because
very
Natasha
short,
will
though.
be too, well, Natasha is going to be too modest to say this. There are two people that we have to thank. There's from UNESCO, there is Anna Lomtadze and her team, and from the Preservation Subcommittee, Natasha. Those two have done thousands and thousands of hours of work to pull this together. Very briefly, I just needed to single those two out and extend a very special appreciation. Thank you, Adam.
Great. Thanks so much. And that saves me making these same comments. I will return the microphone now to Natasha. And I'd like to also extend my thanks to Anna, Kenji, Natasha, and everybody who's worked to put this day together. It's been really inspiring and very insightful, and I hope will be very influential
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody on the locked note for such a thoughtful and really insightful discussions. We are particularly grateful for the directions and the framing of the problems that you have so nicely put forward. Now I would like to address the audience, the excellencies, the ladies and gentlemen. We have now come to the close of the policy dialogue, and I would just conclude with a couple of remarks. First, during the policy dialogues, both in the morning and in the afternoon, we heard prominent speakers from the memory institutions, academia, and the community. They all spoke on 4 areas that present challenges confronting governments, memory institutions, all around the world. So through examples and projects, we have seen and confirmed that indeed we need to take a systematic and principled approach to build a comprehensive international policy to ensure that our actions are supported by very effective policies. And finally, I'd like to point that the dialogue discussions will be summarized in a report that will come out of the Preservation Subcommittee probably over the following month. Some of the outcomes will feed into the second Memory of the World Global Policy Forum. That's the forum on disaster risk reduction and management of sustainable preservation of documentary heritage. That event will be held in 2021. And then finally, on behalf of the Preservation Subcommittee, I wish to convey sincere thanks to everybody involved, the organizers, the moderators, presenters, dialogue contributors, and all of you who are attending virtually. We appreciate particularly your input and your support as we are progressing UNESCO work. The Preservation Committee will be in touch and involve experts through work groups, through task forces, symposia, because we need to work together to address these challenges. So on that note, I will now close the second session of the UNESCO Policy Dialogue on Digital Preservation. Thank you.